Welcome. Thanks very much for coming. I think we're going to have some fun here. My name's Peter Beilhartz. I'm just going to offer you some introductory remarks, which I hope you'll indulge me with, because we're coming to the end of Craig and Pam's visit to us in Melbourne under the auspices of the 50th anniversary of La Trobe and under the organisation and fine leadership of Team Leader Hogan, Super Ted.
Spontaneous cheers from Bobby Rock.
Hey, Hogan, woohoo! So I guess for us, we are wanting to share some ideas and arguments coming out of Craig's life path through sociology and other fields. He ribbed me over lunch saying that the way that this was presented made it sound kind of terminal. But no, it's just beginning. It's only the beginning.
That might be a little extreme too.
Yeah. But if you don't mind, because we're in this setting, which is pretty special for us, I just want to say a bit about Thesis 11, actually, because I think it's true to say that Thesis 11 is, to my way of thinking, a very important part of the La Trobe story, but it's a very peripheral part of the institutional history of La Trobe, and that's to be expected. There are bigger stories to be told about bigger organisational units and bigger achievements. But Thesis 11, among other things, has been the platform or the vehicle for a lot of really interesting activity over fairly close to 40 years now. And it's been not the only platform, but certainly a major kind of field through which we've developed friendships with people around the world and been able to share, especially visitors. So Thesis 11, I think, is a very important platform for this. I don't want to diminish the extent to which what we've done with Craig and what Craig and Pam have done for us has also got a very strong basis in friendship. And friendship's got a bit of press from time to time. Peter Murphy edited a journal about friendship. And along with hospitality, it's become a kind of a new philosophical interest, but none of this would happen were it not for friendship and trust, as well as mutual enthusiasm and so on and so forth. Thesis 11 appears once in the institutional history for the 50th birthday. There's one reference in the new history which refers to us as a left-wing journal. And I want to say to you, well, actually, no. This is not the most useful or serious way to think about what we've done, at least in retrospect. I think what's pretty clear is that Thesis 11 has been an agent of culture building. It's been a carrier of cultural traffic for nearly 40 years. It's nearly 40 years of work, and I guess the thing that I want to draw to your attention there and acknowledge, because there are many people who've been involved in this story, most of them are not here, all of this is based on voluntary labour. Right? I mean, there's enormous contribution of voluntary labour which has made this happen. We've done a lot of different things over the years. If you don't mind me reading out to you some of the visitors that we've brought to Australia and to elsewhere. Craig Calhoun. I think 3 times or twice if you exclude the interview which started our relationship in 91 or something. Jeffrey Alexander, Batici, Papastagiadis, Testa, Kumar, Peter Thomas, Ron Jacobs, Eleanor Townsley, George Steinmetz, Philippa Mainsmith, Alistair Davidson, Stuart McIntyre, Anne Curthoys, Maria Pialara, Ray Gator, Joanna Burke, Ghassan Haj, Patrick Wolfe. Died too young. Robin Archer, Tessa Morris Suzuki, Charles Lemmett, Anthony Elliott, Bernard Smith, George Marquis, Maria Marquis, Donald Sassoon, George Seddon, Tim Winton, Tim Flannery, Peter Newman, David Malouf, Ihab Hassan, Clinton Walker, Paul Carter, Gerard Delante, Simon Tormey, Peter Vale, Ivan Vladislavich, Nolan Murray, to come David Walker, Philip McMichael, Louis David, and a cast of hundreds of Pinoys, very important connection which Trevor forged through the Ateneo in Manila. Ira Raja and a cast of many folks from India, primarily from Delhi, in this case one of Hogan's pièces de résistance, the Festival of Ideas, 2011 I think, primarily his work. Loic Wacan, Ivor Indyk, Orlando Patterson, Gernot Burma, George Ritzer, Charles Taylor. There are more because the centre is 15 years old or thereabouts. It's born, I think, 2002. Before then, of course, we were also engaged in serious intellectual traffic. Alain Touraine, Klaus Offer, Andy Rabenbach, Agnes Heller, Ferenc Feher, constantly. Niklas Luhmann, Castriadis, Martin Jay, Leela Gandhi, John Keane, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Terrell Carver, a very fine fellow called Ralph Miliband, also long ago. I'm not gloating, I'm just trying to register some of this because it's invisible, it's forgotten. It's not forgotten by the people who have been the beneficiaries of these processes. You know, it's not forgotten by Danny Ross, who got to drive Castriadis home when his VW, he'd locked the keys in and blah, blah, blah. You know, actually little transformative experiences that are so important, because if we're lucky, what happens when we have our visitors here is that we get to know them as embodied, sensuous, real people with interests, and we end up at the Cherry Bar on Sunday afternoon, and, you know, there are...
Enough said.
There's a multiplicity of human engagements, which is one of the wonderful things. But I guess more substantively, the point I'm trying to make is that we have had, and we mean to continue to have friends in cultural traffic. We got interlocutors. And more and more and more, I suppose, perhaps especially as the world seems to be more and more difficult, the weight that we want to place on conversation and exchange is more and more important. The idea of passing it on is also very important. So there's a generational story to Thesis 11, which I won't go into now. There's a series of significant events out, which we've done in places like the Philippines, India, the UK, South Africa, Singapore, and now China. There's a series of stuff that people are bound to forget, but I really want to remember, like film events and music events, including a workshop on the history of the blues guitar from the Delta to Chicago by Michael Hubbard. Genius, fantastic teacher. Chris Wilson and Spider-Men, the Beilharz Brothers Blues Band, even. There's been some really serious attempt to think music into what we do, which is why we were starting today with John Mayall too. The 1966 Clapton album, which Craig managed to summon up through his machine. The Festival of Ideas, which I mentioned before. Some ARC grants are really cool. I still think textbook, which I think is one of our best achievements, intellectual achievements ever. A long tradition of mentoring, of teaching and learning from editorial assistants and others. Thousands of book reviews. Yeah, the book review is such an important genre and something which is in decline for various reasons, including that it gets no points. But actually, you know, book reviews are so important as a part of our culture, but also as a way to enable folks who are starting up to cut their teeth, you know, to write a small, manageable piece which leads on to something else. Lots of crossover work with other institutions. We were, I think, responsible for the formation of the New Zealand Australian Studies Society. That was great. That was really terrific. We've worked with people in the Post-Colonial Centre, in the Bauman Institute. We've worked here with the Greeks in the Greek Centre in particular. We've worked with GIAS in Johannesburg and STIAS in Stellenbosch and the International Consortium for Social Theory. I was reminded, forgive me, I'm going to stop soon and hand over to Craig, but I was reminded at Pam's event last night that we also had a signal influence in the improvement of the quality of food delivered at La Trobe events. Because somehow somebody said to us, you should look up these people called Mary and Steve, and this is a plug, right, who do really interesting product-driven food. This had a tangible effect. I think the first time we used them was for an event for Bernard Smith in which the main constituents were art historians, and their response was that the food looked fantastic. It meant that there was a conviviality, an additional kind of layer of engagement, that people didn't leave the room, that they didn't escape because, you know, they couldn't eat university caf food. It's actually, I think, a really important part of this whole sociability kind of culture. Now the irony, I don't know if it's an irony or just a structural fact, but basically one way of looking at us and what we've done, Thesis 11, is to say that we're kind of probably relatively invisible locally, but not globally, and that's an interesting thing to ponder. What I've been trying to tell you about is a story about a life of culture building, which is both global and local. And this also reminds of the importance of memory and narration in what it is that we do. It's interesting conceptually as well in terms of the work that people like Craig have done thinking about the hollowing out of civil society and the fact that it's not reasonable to expect that universities themselves generate high voltage. Good ideas very often come from the interaction between universities and other environments around them. Churches, trade unions, the women's movement, whoever it is, whatever it is. Okay, Craig. I'm not going to say too much about Craig at all. I was reading the newly translated biography of Habermas, yeah? I think it's Müller Doom. It's a very serious tome. Has pictures though. And there's some very cute stuff about Habermas and his relationship with his wife and so on. There's a human part there too. I think it's in the last page, I can't remember the personnel, but somebody says to Habermas, it's a repeat of a conversation in a situation like this. Somebody says to Habermas, tell me, Jürgen, at this stage of your life, do you need me to introduce you with praise? And Habermas says, no, I'm okay. So I think I don't need to praise Craig. There's a life's work, incredible energy, initiative, enthusiasm, openness, it's astonishing capacity to engage and to focus, which you'll be treated to momentarily. Intellectual stimulation of absolutely the first order. What I want to do, and I think we have an hour and a half or something like that, is us talk maybe for an hour if that's not too much, and then throw it to you all. And the cue that I'm following is the one that I've been alluding to about conversation and about interlocutors, because one of the things that I admire about Craig's work, and which I hope I share with him, is a sense of the enormous richness of the traditions that we work out of, but also of the necessity to move out of those traditions. So there's some kind of very interesting series of tensions between learning about traditions and learning how to innovate. What I want to do, and I'll start in this way, is ask Craig to negotiate his life path. To this point around, I think there are 8 interlocutors that I've chosen. Okay, so I'm basically going to hold up an invisible flashcard and invite Craig to talk in the first instance about Jürgen Habermas.
Okay. When I think of Thesis 11, I think of food and music. When I think of Jürgen Habermas, I think of big books and a more austere version of critical theory. So I think, to me, Jürgen Habermas was always already there. as I went to university and became a social theorist. That is, his work, parts of his early work were already widely influential, and so in the context of the late 60s, early 70s, one encountered work on technology and the transformation of society. One encountered work on the nature of academic institutions and various other things, and then this continued on into his work on the Long March through the institutions, legitimation crisis, and similar work. But Habermas was sort of in the background, not the central thematic for my engagements intellectually in the early part of my career. So a variety of other people who may or may not make your flashcards figured sooner and earlier. My engagement with Habermas deepened in the early 1980s when I had a postdoctoral fellowship in Chicago, and the group of fellows that I was with at what was called then the Center for Psychosocial Studies, now Center for Transcultural Studies, decided to read Habermas in depth. And one of our great strengths in that group was we were really serious about in-depth readings. So we had a really intensive reading of Volume 1 of Capital, mediated by Moishe Postone, who was at the time writing what became his book, Time, Labor, and Social Discipline. And we had a very intensive reading of Habermas in general, but particularly the work around the public sphere. And an oddity of Habermas's now very famous work on the public sphere is that it was not famous then. Yeah. It had not been translated into English. The only pieces that existed in English at that point were an encyclopedia article and one excerpt from the book that had been translated in a media and communication scholarship anthology. And Tom McCarthy, who is a part of our group, a key interpreter of Habermas and also translator of Habermas, had the manuscript for what was to have been the English translation of the structural transformation of the public sphere, and told us how it came to not happen the first time around. When there was a rough translation, Habermas basically said, yeah, I'm going to rewrite it completely, so don't do that, and never got around to rewriting it completely. Wrote other books instead, like The Theory of Communicative Action. So, hey, it was a fairly significant accomplishment, but he didn't rewrite the public sphere book. We read in a mixture of German, English, and interestingly French, the Habermas work and explored it, among other things, convinced Tom to go and commission the finishing of the translation. Jürgen came and stayed with us for a while, and so we had a chance to explore with him in this interaction. And I was very taken with that book. So let me just stress that my path into engagement with Habermas really starts there. It's background before that, which I had read 2 or 3 books, and I'd been in seminars where that was a topic, but it wasn't a focus for me. And this mattered as a focus to me because of the Thesis 11 subtitle, which was not yet the Thesis 11 subtitle, but that notion of critical theory that was also historical sociology. I would almost say not and, critical theory and historical sociology as 2 different things, but the idea of doing critical theory through historical sociology. And I think basic to my engagement, though I wouldn't have been able to say it quite the same way then, is this desire. Pierre Bourdieu may make your flashcards at some point, and Pierre Bourdieu has a nice way of framing this on the lines of philosophy asks the best questions, but they can't be answered by philosophy alone. They can only be answered in an empirical and practical engagement with the world. So you need to ask these questions about what does it mean to be human or other core philosophical questions, but then you need to go beyond abstract speculation in your armchair to actually going out and looking at what's happening in the world in one way or another. Well, the same thing with Habermas, only it was more of a surprise with Habermas, because he doesn't programmatically say that. He programmatically announces something closer to a complete rereading of Western philosophy with a new synthesis coming. in a very German manner. He's going to create the big new synthesis. He explores, and lots of his early work involves workings through many other intellectual contributions to that tradition. So a book like Knowledge and Human Interests of early Habermas is, among other things, Habermas carrying out his own education in public as he reads through and critically appropriates and thinks through a variety of different thinkers. There's a tradition of this in European thought. So people can think of Habermas in this classical model, if you will, and many did and have, and it distanced him from sociology. That is, to be thought of as an abstract philosophical thinker producing a synthesis of Western European history, distanced him from sociology, which is a discipline that is ultimately empirical and about the world in a more immediate sense, not about the history of philosophy. It may draw on it. And the structural transformation, the Strukturwandel, the early 60s book that was Habermas's Habilitationsschrift and the object of this attention in my group in the early 80s, is different. It has history of philosophy in it, but it really is organized more as a kind of historical sociology of the shifts in the organization of the public sphere and the dialectic between what was happening materially and in social organization and what was happening in thinking about the public sphere and thinking in the public sphere. And I loved that as a strategy, and it brought Habermas closer. Now, in many ways, Legitimation Crisis has similar sorts of material engagements, and Habermas moved through both of these in various ways in his career. But for me, this was the discovery of the critical theory and historical sociology moment and of a different way to think about Habermas. Now, my earlier thinking was in a way, and it was wrong, unfair to Habermas, because Habermas was much more historically grounded than he looked like. So if you read him as just somebody writing a history of especially German, but more broadly European thought in, say, Knowledge and Human Interests, you could think of this as a timeless exercise. Well, Schelling had a variety of important things to say, and Hegel had a variety of important things to say, and there are many important things to say. That book has an idea in it which is different, and it has history in it in a way that's different. So the idea is what Habermas calls Erkenntnisinteresse, the knowledge-forming interest, right? The idea that knowledge doesn't just accumulate. Knowledge isn't just the result of creating facts and then they live. Knowledge is always given order by the intellectual engagement that people bring to it. And so each of the different thinkers that he explores in that book, he explores with an eye to their knowledge-forming interest. What was it in their relationship to the world around them that made them want to think about these questions, that made them want to be able to answer these questions? And so there was actually a more embedded historical and sociological moment to this. It was hard to spot for at least me, but a young reader in the US with an inadequate education in the history of philosophy, which I take to be a description of most sociologists in the US. That is, we didn't learn all of these philosophers, and therefore there was something daunting about thinking you had to know all about Schelling or Hegel or Feuerbach or something before you could get to the sociologically interesting points. And I think most sociology has suffered from this. That is, there's all sorts of rich work in the intellectual tradition that doesn't become part of our living sociology because we feel we'd have to do too much homework. But at the same time, it's completely understandable because it would take the rest of everybody's life to do all of this homework. And so I think bridging that becomes an interesting challenge and part of the work on the tradition you refer to. Now, let me bring it back to some more summary. the historical engagements that Habermas looked at in that earlier book were similar to what he would later look at in the philosophical discourse of modernity, different thinkers, but they were how the historical unfolding of the modern era shaped a variety of problems of understanding and acting in the world, which shaped a series of intellectual projects of trying to deepen or improve that understanding in order to act better in the world. Think Thesis 11, right? That is the original thesis on Feuerbach and the body of the journal, that the relationship between theory and practice, the relationship between deepening intellectual understanding and the capacity to act is basic. And think, in this case, an argument which sounds like somebody else, not Habermas, if you have the general stereotypical Habermas as system builder view, the argument that that's from an embedded perspective. Okay? Now, the engagement that we had with the structural transformation of the public sphere made it much easier to see that because the book was much more explicitly historically grounded and analyzing some specific historical changes, like the rise of an ideal of public communication. Was it possible for citizens formed in more or less private life, family, and so forth, to develop critical capacities which they used to expand public understanding and inform the potential action of the state? I could say more about the substance of the book, but that already is a historical claim for Habermas. It's that, in that case of the book, I mean, I personally think the dating is not quite right, and so I can make a different substantive argument, but let me leave that to one side. He says in the 18th century, this public sphere comes into being. It comes into being in literature and people commenting on literature, and it comes into being in politics. People think about it. And the key hallmarks are that people take on the ability, learn the ability to distance themselves from their particularistic identities and structures of authority in order that the best argument should win instead of the most empowered speaker. So instead of an aristocrat's opinion always being better than a non-aristocrat's, there was a relative equality of the public sphere. That didn't take the aristocrat's money and give it to a poor person. It was only for the purpose of discussion, but it was powerful. And so this idea grows up in the 18th century, says Habermas, not paying the attention I would think he should have paid to the 17th century and religious debates or scientific debates or something, but grows up, and it's important because it informs the idea of democracy. And it gives what he would later describe as one of the unfulfilled promises of bourgeois democracy. So even though this happens in bourgeois society, it happens with the rise of the bourgeoisie, displacing the aristocracy from leadership, wanting to create this egalitarian sphere in which they could, worried about themselves, not worried about the workers, worried about the bourgeoisie getting equality with the aristocrats. What it does is set up, and it's something important to the idea of democracy, that people could carry out a rational critical discussion that would improve understanding of publicly important issues in these settings where equality was only for the occasion of the conversation, based on some norms about how you took turns and how the conversation worked, and could advance a collective understanding that could inform the state and really matter in politics. And there are a variety of things that even Habermas would later change about his account, but the idea is powerful. And he says, and it's powerful in a way that is relevant to Habermas writing it in the late 50s and early 60s. That is, a variety of Marxists in that period and others are arguing, forget bourgeois democracy, throw it over. It doesn't matter. We need the revolution. Absent the revolution, all of this ordinary democracy is a waste. Right? And Habermas reacts against that. There's also the general culture of silence in Germany, that World War II and the Holocaust are not being critically examined. The Adenauer era is an era of repressing that critical examination with the most important things that have gone on in people's lifetimes. So in each of these, with each of these things in mind, Habermas is saying, actually democracy is important. Actually this public debate is important. It's important whether or not all the policies the government takes are good policies to be able to have this debate among citizens and inform the government, and we need to reclaim that. The book would become important to the 60s and to all sorts of other things, and I tell lots of stories about the book, but the important thing is that he's recognizing from a historical vantage point the power of reclaiming something with historical roots which had been debased and undermined in the meantime. So in the meantime, he says there's been a rise of public relations and managed discourse and a sort of manipulated public sphere. And we can reclaim the core idea, its unfinished work of modernity. And this was very powerful. So this is the heart of my engagement with Habermas. Now then you can go on and look at a lot of the rest of his work and see how it has similar engagements, and they fall into place in relationship to it, although he pursues different strategies. At some points he takes an evolutionary approach where he's going to see how the evolution of speech is the core thing. So there are different approaches, but they are all approaches in which he's interested in trying to restore, reanimate, deepen, and expand this unfinished project of modernity, and in particular the unfinished project of reason and critical reason in public among people, and the idea that this critical reason could move forward even ahead of a change in the class structure of society, that you didn't have to first have the revolution, and which he thought was a terrible idea because then you invite a kind of Leninist, vanguardist approach to the revolution. You could first have the critical discussion, right, and work to change society. And the material basis wasn't class struggle per se, it was public spaces. So it was things like coffee shops in which people could get together and talk. So it opens up something wonderful. Now, it continues to animate his work for his whole life and an engagement with it, which is terrific and takes on a pathos now when democracy looks fragile in much of the world, and when part of what looks fragile is the way in which publics and public opinion work. The formation of public opinion does not look like an ideal model of rational critical discourse in most of the world most of the time. Some people just say, oh, Habermas got it wrong, it's not rational critical. I would like to say, with I think Habermas, that's still a good ideal for at least part of public communication. We ought to explore why it seems so hard for us to live up to that ideal, to achieve that kind of reason in the current circumstances, but we should still care. We shouldn't write off democracy and say, well, it looks like authoritarian government in China seems to be moving ahead economically, let's just do that. We shouldn't do that. We really should work harder at figuring out how to make critical reason actually powerful in the world. Now, as it happens, I think there's one, from my point of view, flaw here. Habermas would not agree with me in his way of doing it, which is he thinks critical reason has to work in a kind of transcendence of, maybe even escape from culture and from thick identities. And I think the issue has to be figuring out how critical reason works in culture and alongside other cultural processes that remake us at the same time. So I think that there's a false start in this separation. Now, this is reproduced in a variety of others. Look at Jonathan Israel and the Enlightenment or something. There are a lot of people who want to reproduce a sharp separation between critical reason and everything else. But I think that undermines Habermas's project, because I think a lot of what happens to democracy happens in cultural change outside of critical reason, but not completely divorced from it. And critical reason remains important, but important in constant interaction with other kinds of cultural change, not separated from them. And so I have some different views, but this then is an engagement that will be important ever after my work. Very immediately, together with others of my group of fellow fellows at the center, organized a conference on Habermas's book to coincide with its release in English. That became a surprisingly successful volume. It was in something like its 21st reprinting, the last I checked, because it brought together a variety of voices. And the last thing I'll say about this, I'm not sure how long I'm supposed to talk in response to each question, but you said you have 8, so I'm going to shut up. Not because I was just incredibly brilliant or something, for whatever reason, part of what happened with that conference, net of Habermas's book, was that we brought together very different kinds of intellectual interlocutors. Mm-hmm. So it brought together feminist thinkers like Nancy Fraser with historians who are approaching this in Keith Baker's in terms of particular national histories, with political theorists and sociologists and people who had different examples in mind of what democratic movements and democratic processes were. In particular, it was a moment when the connection to feminism was extremely important and very productive in Western social theory, and that's been a very inconstant connection. Feminism, in many ways, later became a more self-contained field of theoretical discussion that didn't have the same cross-fertilizations. But in that period, the period of Fraser, whom I mentioned, and Shayla Ben-Habib, and Iris Marion Young, and a variety of thinkers, there was a lot of productive cross-fertilization, which I found very important in this. And an echo of what the student movements of the very early 60s and the trade union movements before that had meant for successions of critical theorists, a bridge between practical activism outside the university and the intellectual work in the university. Now, feminism didn't last, unfortunately, in that any more than the others had lasted, and a more insular academia came afterwards. But that was also, for me, a point of conceptually getting it. I think I'd had glimmerings of this before, but getting more clearly that I wanted to work in ways that bridged the broader public and the academic public, that I didn't think we could live up to that Habermasian ideal very well, separating them.
We've been talking for, I guess, a week now, and when Craig arrived...
I knew I talked a long time.
with intermissions. The second conversation you had at the ABC last week with Scott Stephen, he asked you also about Habermas, and I guess one of the things that you said there was that whatever else, Habermas was an exemplary intellectual, that there was something admirable about persistence, about duration, about engagement. But the other day when we were talking about critical social theory, and I was half teasing Craig, 1995, what would a second edition look like? What would it look like now? What would happen if you were writing the same, or addressing a similar kind of problem complex? What you said to me then was that if you wrote a book like that, it would not be a book like that, it would be a book about Pierre Bourdieu. So flashcard number 2 is indeed Pierre Bourdieu.
Okay, let me explain a little bit what I meant. And so in a way, Habermas is the big spirit. The critical theory book in 95 has a bunch about Bourdieu, and one of the agendas, in fact maybe the dominant agenda of that book, is to expand the idea of critical theory. So what I was worried about at that point was people making critical theory a school and not an agenda for social theory and social science in general. And I think schools are sometimes real and good things, but generally not so helpful. And the fragmenting of the theory world into little schools isn't my personal taste, and I would even say is problematic. That I like crossing, I think people should be widely educated. I'm frustrated with a tendency in a lot of social science for people to find their theoretical favorite and show up and say, well, I really love James Coleman, I really love Nikos Balantzas, I really love Castoriadis, and therefore I'm not going to read anyone else, right? And I think that that's untrue to the love objects, because they all read a bunch of other people, and it's intellectually pernicious. I think that the attempt to just go deeper and deeper and deeper into your favorite is counterproductive. It's not just neutral, it's just not, it damages the theory world. the theory world needs people to recognize theory as conversation, a little bit of what Habermas tries to do, philosophical discourses in modernity. And in relation to critical theory, there's a particular betrayal of the heritage of critical theory on the part of people who want to make this a purely academic object of esoteric antiquarian interest, debating interpretations of Adorno or things like this. And there is, critical theory is just esoteric enough in its classical version to invite becoming a branch of German studies devoted to these various dead philosophers with no purchase in society. So again, not unlike Thesis 11 in this sense. My engagement, my interest is in critical theory as living theory. And therefore, in learning from Horkheimer and Adorno and the other classical critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, ways to approach questions that we needed to ask now, and ways to think about critical theory that could expand what counts as critical theory. So what I said about feminism a moment ago is a good example. Most feminist critical theory is not deeply indebted to the Frankfurt School. Now, Sheila Ben Habib, whom I mentioned, is, but most is not. And yet it's critical theory in important ways. So Dorothy Smith is a critical theorist. She's not a Frankfurt School critical theorist. And so I didn't like the idea of property rights in theory. Oh, critical theory, they own it over in Frankfurt. And so the way Bourdieu appears in part is in that book is as one example of trying to expand critical theory. I think, Bourdieu would hate to be called a critical theorist. He wrote a very nice blurb for the book jacket, so he didn't reject it, but he really didn't like the Germanic approach as he saw it. Didn't like some of the influence of Hegel in France, but he particularly didn't like the system building approach. So a contrast between Habermas and Bourdieu is that Habermas was all about the architecture, there is still, and not only Habermas, and he's supremely a master at this. And he's, in the Augustinian sense, building a house with many rooms, and he remembers what's in every room. And he is a remarkably clear and well-organized thinker. For those of you who find him hard to read, take my word for it. But he is a remarkably clear and well-organized thinker. He's difficult sometimes, because he demands a lot of his readers in his more academic work. But the project is one of getting the whole picture organized. And he has it all in view synoptically. And when he changes his mind on something, he has to then go rearrange everything else. So as in his recent work, he's taken up religion, something he had more or less ignored in his earlier work. It then keeps causing him to have to go revisit a variety of other points and reorganize and rethink, and that's the way he works. It's not even remotely the way Bourdieu worked. Bourdieu is a more systematically educated, more deeply philosophical sociologist than is at first apparent when you read a lot of his work. There is more system behind it, but his style is better characterized by Roger Brubaker's phrase of thinking of theory as his habitus rather than his corpus in this sense. And so it's a practice, it's an engagement. Bourdieu is, in a way, maddening because he keeps changing slightly the meaning of his terms, or depending on what argument he's in. Well, he's arguing with Lévi-Strauss, so he's going to accent this. He's arguing with Sartre, he's going to accent that. And he is always engaged in the practice of conversation and the practice of empirical analysis and the practice of argument. He is consummately an agonistic thinker. So you could get the impression from Habermas, it would be wrong, that it's all self-contained and it's just everything in the room. In fact, he is in deep conversation and he's very historically rooted. He's, the last few years engaged with religion and with the crisis of the European Union. It's, but you could look at theory of communicative action and think it's all an abstract system. You can't think that about Bourdieu. That's what you miss. You look at Bourdieu and you think it's all these empirical engagements with Algeria or with status hierarchy in France or with education or with that. The translation of Bourdieu into English reinforced that because it appeared out of order in fragments with different engagements dominating. Mm-hmm. So Bourdieu first shows up looking like an anthropologist of Algeria, then he shows up looking like an analyst of credential society and educational systems, and these don't get connected. And in the US, they reach, and in the West in general, English language world, they reach different disciplinary audiences because sadly, sociologists don't read anthropology, so they don't know about the anthropology work, and the educationists don't read the cultural work. And, so there's this reception in fragments that is very problematic for Bourdieu. But I wanted to insist he really was a critical theorist. He really did have an integrated theoretical agenda, and it fit with my account of what critical theory was. And I had built in the book a sort of specific idea about that. I won't try to repeat all of, but it started with the idea that critical theory is not just criticizing in the everyday sense of the term. I don't like this, that's bad. Critical theory is the improvement of knowledge through understanding how knowledge gets formed, understanding the intellectual tradition in which it gets formed and where you are appropriating and building on what goes before and where you're challenging it or changing it, being able to explain why it should be changed, being able to thus give an account of the limits of previous understanding, and therefore why you're able to go beyond that, and to be able to explain something about the bases on which you work. And here I find Bourdieu a wonderful exemplar of this, including in being able to give a reflexive account of the conditions of his own academic work and the ways in which they are complicating, but to do that, starting with things he pointed out that many others, including Habermas, didn't, like the capacity to be a critical theorist depends first and foremost on socially organized leisure time. That is, that there are reasons why those people with no spare time to read all this work in the tradition, to do research, to think, don't have as much chance to do it. It's not that they have a intellectual incapacity and in other circumstances couldn't have do it. It's not they don't have a gray matter in their brains, but it is that it takes time. And more than just time, it takes certain organized opportunity to step back from the immediate practical affairs of life in order to look at them. And then you need to analyze what is that scholarly position? What is that stance, that perspective that is created? How does it encourage you to get things wrong as well as right? So having the academic privilege to look at social life, you may also look at it in particularly academic sorts of ways. You may produce, just pick an example of that, a rational choice theory that imagines everybody goes about making these constant choices in their lives and underestimates the role of a non-explicit, taken for granted culture in shaping lots of what goes on, because professors are in the business of making explicit all of these choice sequences that most people aren't, except in very peculiar circumstances, like buying a new car or something. And so Bourdieu is interested simultaneously in some big changes in the world, which I was also interested in, and in trying to understand how to look at them and how to create the beginnings of a self-correcting reflexivity for academics to be able to look at them better, to shape our scholarly point of view on them. My original contact with Bourdieu started, at least in earnest, before the Habermas, in about 1976 or so, 75 maybe, when I bought Outline of a Theory of Practice at a bookshop next to the train station in Manchester, England, and started reading it on the train back to Oxford, and kept reading it most of that night, and kept reading it for days, and became transformed by that reading. And now I've since read massive amounts of the rest of Bourdieu, and I don't think my early understanding was right in every regard, but it was a hugely forming understanding. Not because I was doing a project on Algeria and the Kabyle in Algeria, because it helped me think my own intellectual orientation, and helped me think basically about something that I was already thinking with other sources in mind, but that has continued to engage me, which was implicit in a way in your question. You talked about traditions. Let me think how people are embedded in traditions, in culture, in ways of life, how these are practically reproduced, and how limited our abilities to self-consciously change them are. And therefore, not that that never happens, but that there are all these other things going on. Something that you could approach in a different world, closer to Habermas, with Hans-Georg Gadamer, and Gadamer's work on tradition. But that's all about texts. Bourdieu's work on lived reality, how we're enmeshed in lived reality, how hard it is to escape from the enmeshment, even a little bit, in order to rethink what we're doing. Was very basically important to my early work, but has shaped my whole influence. Now, the reason I said what I said a couple days ago, or whenever it was we were talking, that if I were rewriting the book, my sense of both my engagement, but also what is needed and missing, if I needed to give a push to social theory in one direction or another, right now it would not be a push to widen critical theory. I'm still in favor of that, but I don't think that's a problem. That's not one of our big problems now. But I do think a push to think much more deeply about what it is to be a human being and practical actor in the world is. I think we're pushed by new technologies. I think we're pushed by globalization. I think we're pushed by a lot of things. And Bourdieu is a great way to think that. So quite seriously, if I were to start out to write a book again with similar, it would be trying to expand critical theory more and trying to expand historical sociology more by bringing in some of the sorts of perspective from Bourdieu, but also critically engaging ways in which I think Bourdieu is either locked into a French perspective or missing something that's going on or overstating one dimension of it. But I think it puts on the table, as I thought in 1995 Frankfurt School of Critical Theory put on the table, lots that was needed on the table. And I'll close with just a couple of observations. So Bourdieu would be at the top of a list for me in many ways. Some of them similar to what I said about Habermas. This is theory and practice and empirical work at the same time. This is not, I will theorize and then I will take an action in the world, or I will theorize, I will go do an empirical research project. The classic and usually bad thesis written by a student, which is a sandwich in which there's some theoretical prolegomena, bread, some empirical meat, and then there's some theoretical conclusions, bread again. This, I find frustrating, right? But with Bourdieu, the ability to move on these things together at once. It makes him difficult to read. It makes him a wonderful thinker. And the bringing of a phenomenological perspective into sociology, I think sociology has not learned what it could have learned from the phenomenological perspective. That's important. But also just working in all these registers at once seems needed for many of the problems that we need to confront today. And that's what would motivate me and what I meant by that statement. Maybe that's enough to say about it given the limits of time, with just the footnote that we have some specific difficulties with this, with a very large preponderance of instrumental thinking about human beings and social life that worries me, with an inadequate sense of the social coloring even sociology, let alone other fields' work. So at the moment I'm thinking a fair amount about artificial intelligence, and one of the things that's problematic in a lot of discussions is there is no social in any way. So there may even be ethical considerations, but they're not ethical considerations informed by a strong idea of the social. They are informed as how should an individual agent behave, what should be programmed into an artificially created individual agent, how should it behave. They're very asocial understandings. There's not a strong sense of that, and I find Bourdieu particularly helpful for this.
Thank you. I'm going to hold you one more flashcard and ask you please to talk
said 8
about that. And then what I'm going to do, because I'm watching the clock, is...
You can ask me one-word answers.
Well,
Foucault.
Almost. Yeah, it's kind of speed dating. I'll run through the remainder of the list, and invite you either to, pick up or pass or say no thanks or whatever. But
who's your one that you want more from?
Well, you know it's coming, don't you? It's Charles Taylor.
Yeah, I figured that. So I met Charles Taylor as a student at Oxford, where I considered myself a Marxist, and I thought I ought to know more about Hegel. And so I put a fair amount of effort into reading Marx, and I was not by any means the master of all of Marxist thought, but Taylor was offering a seminar on Hegel and the modern state, and I thought, cool, I will go learn that. And this will deepen my knowledge. And I had come to Marxism not by the Hegelian philosophical path, but Marx in the political world and disproportionately a more economic-centered Marx. The seminar was, shall I say, daunting. So I got to Taylor's seminar. There are a lot of other people there. And I might add, I keep running into people now, 35 years later or whatever it is, who were in that same seminar. I mean, I was all running into people, and they'll say, yeah, Taylor's seminar. Yeah, we were in the same room. We didn't know each other at that time, the formative thing. So Taylor's seminar was really on the philosophy of right, though with a lot of other Hegel. And it started with I thought, completely intelligent discussion of the opening of the philosophy of right. And they're taking notes, being a good student. And something I had anticipated, there's a discussion of translation, and people are speaking German, and my German's not up to it. And I'm really concentrating to try to follow what they're saying, and I realize they're discussing the translation of Greek into German. And I don't have any Greek, and it goes on like this, and it's not just the linguistic translation, it's the amount of philosophical concepts. So Taylor, from my earliest experience of him, was absolutely terrifying, is the world's gentlest, nicest, easygoing man, and has a completely easy conversational style that is sort of deceptive. You almost don't notice when he begins to speak another language and refer to somebody you've never heard of before. And, but in fact, it's a problem for following. So in this sense, very different from either Habermas or Bourdieu, each of whom is in certain ways difficult. Habermas writes very clearly when he writes a Die Zeit op-ed, but when he's writing an academic book, he is Herr Professor, and it's more complicated and organized. Bourdieu develops this maddening style, which he will say is all intentional, and French people reassure me frequently is brilliant, but speaking as someone who has translated Bourdieu, it's difficult, in which he has, for somebody who is biased against Germans, he has really long sentences with lots of subordinate clauses. And he will say, well, it's because I want to stop people from making false intellectual oppositions and get them to think several contradictory things at once. Okay, but it's not easy. And Taylor's wonderfully easy. He's limpid, he's conversational, it's sort of graceful, he's very inviting for inclusion. I didn't drop out of the seminar. I thought, okay, I'm just going to have to work really hard. I can't learn Latin and Greek fast enough. I am, but I can read everything in translation. And it was an enormous education, partly about Hegel, but partly things like there would be a discussion of Plato, and I'd realize I hadn't read the Plato, and I'd rush off to read the Plato, and of other things. So I got a very funny sort of introduction to a lot of the Western philosophical tradition by trying to remedy my own inadequate education in order to be able to follow Chuck talking about Hegel. And and I had some other interaction with him, but I was not his student mainly, and I was actually I was studying history and writing about something else. So this sort of ended a phase. At that same Center for Psychosocial Studies that had Habermas in, at one point, we got where we were very engaged in questions about speech and human agency. We brought Chuck in for a visit, and that renewed a relationship. And that was just at the time that he was beginning to work on a politics of recognition issues. And I was interested in those too. So I had a renewed relationship. Now I've since written probably more about Taylor than actually about Bourdieu or Habermas. I don't know that it's a more formative engagement for me. Now Taylor becomes a close personal friend in a way that I was close to Bourdieu and I'm friendly with Habermas, but they are senior professors or were, Bourdieu was while he was alive, and I was, somebody who enjoyed a pleasant relationship with them, but I wouldn't have said Bourdieu was my close personal friend or something like that. I do say that of Taylor. But also his wonderful, generous intellectual style is something that I would seek to emulate. Substantively, his work has been important to me at different points with different facets evident. The work on multiculturalism, on politics of recognition, all shaped a lot of thinking about that. And one of the things I wanted to argue about was that that there were majoritarian versions of this, that you could extend this idea and should in wide ways. In a way, the whole politics of identity conversation moved off in a different direction from where Chuck had been engaged in it, unfortunately. At another point, interested in in questions about social cohesion and integration, his Hegel work took on a different meaning for me and a different significance. More recently, work of his that I'd read early on that hadn't been so important to me on explanation itself and mechanistic explanation and the nature of models for explanation became important and interesting to me. As I mentioned, I'm interested in computer models and things like that. There's a whole world of highly mechanistic, reductionistic models where the kind of thinking that he, along with friends of his like Bert Dreyfus and others, did is very important for thinking past the mechanistic reductions and all of that. And then during the last 30 years when we've been close, the evolution of thinking about social imaginaries, the evolution of thinking about democracy itself and its challenge and democratic culture and how it worked has been basic. I have stayed connected to several other people around that center and meet regularly in a group that includes Charles and a set of other people, reflected in the Social Imaginaries conversation, which was transcribed and edited and appeared in Social Imaginaries 2 years ago.
First issue.
That reflects who that group is and some of the nature. An extremely formative conversation with me. So, while I've had a number of conversations with Bourdieu or Habermas, I wouldn't say that conversation has been the main way I've learned from them. I've learned, like the rest of us, by reading their work. I would say with Taylor that as important as reading his work has been, talking with him has been even more important in shaping my thinking about a variety of questions and learning how to think with him about some of those things.
I was going to mention the word religion, but I'm not. I'll mention it.
Yes,
and
important.
You should do what you want
Yeah.
with it. But shall I do my other flashcards and let you choose?
Do your other flashcards and I'll
Okay.
go.
So the next, number 4, was going to be a change of, it's not a joke, but it's a bit mischievous. I was wondering about so-called minor figures, and the two that came to mind for me were Merton and Gluckman. Because there's a presupposition.
Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
Wow.
Minor figures.
Well, but that's...
Okay. Would really wound either of them. Neither was ego-free.
Yeah. But I mean, it's actually a very,
So let me give an answer, because I'm totally engaged with this, but I can be brief.
Figures.
So, there are people who are of enormous influence in their lives who are going to drop out of the sociological canon, in my opinion. Not because they should. I actually find lots that's valuable in their work, but they will. In segmentary lineage societies, what I did my earliest work on, even before the English workers' work, that have ancestral trees for reckoning around the world, one of the general features is that people reckon many fewer generations. So they have reckoning back to the beginning of time, but the beginning of time tends to be 10 or 12 generations. And if you push them, they'll say it was 6,000 years ago. You say, well, that's not 10 or 12 generations. But what happens is there are 2 or 3 ancestors at the beginning. So the first one was this, and you get 2 or 3. Then there's this big gulf into which ancestors fall and get forgotten. And then there's your great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and you. And I'm afraid that what happens in social theory is this. So as the editor, co-editor of two anthologies of social theory, a classical theory and a contemporary theory anthology, there is an abyss into which theorists fall between classical and contemporary. And a few, I suspect, in social theory, Bourdieu and Habermas both, probably not Taylor. In philosophy, Taylor's very important, but in social theory, I'm not sure. But they will become classics. But some other really, really important thinkers who've reshaped our thinking may or may not. And Gluckman and Merton fall into this. I reckon Merton was the most influential American sociologist of the middle of the 20th century, that people are wrong to think it was Parsons. Parsons is the most influential theorist, producing a little bit, like I said, of Habermas, a big picture synoptic architecture theory. But he had very little influence on the empirical sociology that Americans did. Merton had enormous influence on the kind of empirical projects and even the very style for what counted as a good empirical project and a standard article to publish in the ASR or the AJS. Merton was, so he had a very, very big influence. Lots of his insights remain very current, but people have forgotten they had anything to do with him. So he coined the concept opportunity cost, used on a daily basis in economics, nobody knows that was Merton. If his son weren't a Nobel laureate economist, the economists would all keep forgetting it, but his son keeps reminding them and things like that. But any number of phrases, the unintended consequences of purposive social action, live on. Everybody remembers unintended consequences. They may or may not have ever read Merton's 1936 article.
And there was focus groups,
He invented focus groups. The idea of focus groups, he used to say, if only I had patented it and copyrighted it and could get royalties. He called it the focused group interview that began that. And he and Paul Lazarsfeld, an enormous body of work together, training people at Columbia, but also shaping research agendas and all this. So I won't belabor it, but I think Merton's important. Merton is interesting to reread. I recommend it. I've bothered to edit a book about him because I think he's important, but I predict he does not make it into the canon. So the feature of the canon is, I'm going to sound very cynical, but it's, I think, sort of true. There are two theory classes. There's classical and contemporary. You can't put an infinite number of work into either, so that there's sort of 12 to 15 figures who can go into classical theory. And if the potential classical theorist doesn't rise to the importance to supplant someone. So, all right, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim are all going to make it Zimmel. Well, but Zimmel's a pretty big figure to have to supplant to get into the book. And so classical thinkers do fall out. Mannheim is falling out. He, in the middle of the 20th century, would have always been in those anthologies. Now he's not. But there's not enough room for all the major figures. If contemporary means people who did their main work during the lifetime or the adult life of the editors of the anthologies, there are always these people aging out of it and falling into that abyss, and so Merton will. Gluckman's a different story as an anthropologist, not mainly a theorist, although a very theoretically inclined anthropologist. For me, personally very important. He was my teacher, and I lived in his house, and I was very close to Max, and he was a important intellectual influence in sort of ways of thinking about some things and shaping my career. What I would say is my sense of sociology is that it is impoverished by not having learned enough from anthropology generally, but specifically from British social anthropology and specifically from a generation that Gluckman represents, although the greatest representatives are Evans, Pritchard, and Fortes. Evans, Pritchard, and Fortes and Gluckman, of approximately the same age grade, the great sort of World War II and after era of British social anthropology, broadly in the Radcliffe Brownian tradition, are just extraordinarily rich thinkers for thinking what the social is, the thing I said Bourdieu is so important for too. Working with African societies and very different examples against which sociology is biased by thinking they aren't important and leaving them out, they do very rich work of thinking about what it means to be socially organized, how the personal, the face-to-face, the small group, and the larger, more abstract systems interrelate with each other and so forth. So I will not belabor the point, though I am quite prepared to belabor it for hours because I like it, that this is an intellectual perspective. Because it's the perspective of a field and of multiple people, it also is going to not make it in there. They were widely read in sociology at an earlier period, but they're not going to make it into this corpus, but we will be less for ignoring them. And there are other figures like Levi-Strauss and so forth, other non-sociologists who are significant. I do have a companion in this, which is that Michael Bouravoy is also a Gluckmanian at one remove. That is, he was taught by one of Max's most important early students and has celebrated this. And one of Gluckman's great contributions was perhaps the most sophisticated account of the case study method that's ever been produced. As distinct, and case study doesn't mean looking at, the Trobriand Islands, they're a case. It means looking at a socially organized situation as a case of something. And Bouravoy has celebrated this, and much of his training as one of the most important trainers of ethnographers in sociology has been to get students to do a good job with these expanded case studies. So he's not absent from sociology, but he's not a force in a way.
I mean, I suppose the curiosities that I'm bringing to bear here are partly continuous with those that I started my introductory remarks with about visibility and invisibility, but also, I mean, we're talking about lots of things. We're talking about, needless to say, rock music. We're talking about guitar players, and we're talking about the minor figures who are actually transformative. I mean, so there's a hierarchy. You might or might not.
We're also talking, though, about the social construction of what it means to be minor and major and how it can change.
Yeah, sure.
Right? That these that at first glance these sound like simple evaluations.
Yeah.
Did better work, did less work, less important work, or whatever. But it turns out, as in my kinship example, which I will stick to, my anthropology hat on, what makes an ancestor important is descendants. And it's not whether your great-great-grandfather was a great guy, it's whether there are enough descendants of your great-great-grandfather to make a kinship group that determines whether he's still significant in the lineage. Because the ancestors who live on are those that demarcate groups of present-day descendants. And so those that either don't have enough or don't structure, they're not distinctive, they merge with other groups, doesn't happen. And this goes on in sociology too. I'll give you another quick example that is not part of my particular lineage, or not central to it. Symbolic interactionism and ethnomethodology, two very different opposing schools of microsociological analysis that gradually are coming to look sort of similar. Ethnomethodology is almost disappearing, and to the extent it's remembered, it's sort of a vague adjunct, and people, Goffman, Garfinkel, all sort of the same. Not the same at all, but in fact, this will come to be a sort of background to ethnography, microsociology, in which their theoretical differences won't divide people up the way they would once have. They would have once have virtually brought them to blows, but they will look like they occupy a similar corner of sociology for the future.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just read you a list, okay, and then I'll fall into silence.
I'll make hand
until I
signals.
close. Okay. Michel Foucault, but after that, and as I guess as a kind of proxy for thinking about Americanism, pragmatism, if we had more time, maybe later, Richard Rorty.
Let me give you the really quick answers. Foucault, absolutely great. The more I read Foucault, the more important. Reading the posthumous lectures recently, very rich, important for thinking about history, thinking about what historical ruptures and breaks make. The Bachelardian point, but that Foucault elaborated in great ways. Really a victim of being popular. The various popularizations of Foucault all do damage to Foucault's major intellectual contributions, whether they are the early superstructuralist or the discipline and punish era in the middle sort of era of the history of sexuality, the recent governmentality. And the people, people say governmentality, I want to reach for my gun. Not that there was no good intellectual work, but it became a shortcut for not thinking. So I said earlier, I didn't like when people just had a favorite. I really don't like it when they just have a favorite and they want to claim about 10% of his work as being the whole. Foucault, Rorty, no particular influence on me. Interesting man, met him a few times. I thought he was smart, read some of his work. Things I liked, things I didn't like, no particular influence. Pragmatism, lots of influence, but through Dewey and Peirce and Mead and other earlier thinkers, in which I found this very rich. I wrote a long letter to Max Gluckman once asking, actually I had the same argument with Merton, so I had with each of these two teachers of mine, Gluckman and Merton, arguments about things like, why is George Herbert Mead not important in your view of sociology? Merton, I mean, it is important. Look, I did this, but he's not important. He's a token for a certain kind of perspective, and Mead worked on all these other things that don't travel, and the underlying pragmatism doesn't come with it. So people pick up bits of mind, self, and society, but they don't grasp the underlying pragmatist philosophy in that way. And I think there's work that's really important there, and it's partly because of the way intellectual divisions of labor, and we don't work on language, we don't work on speech interaction as much as we might. So I think there's much that's important in that should be brought. And no disrespect to Rorty, but he just wasn't an important intellectual source for me.
Sure. Edward Thompson, Karl Marx.
Both pretty important. So Thompson was a transformative figure for me, Marx in a way too. I end up being one of the people who get labeled by some as post-Marxists, meaning that I had a very strong engagement with Marx. I still consider myself very much influenced by that, but I am not orthodox or just part of a Marxist tradition. So Marx really important. I'm influenced by things like by Moishe Postone and by other people who are interpreters of Marx as well as by Marx. I'm always amused by my friend Moishe, who has wonderful, brilliant ideas, and he wants to say everything was said first by Marx. So I'm always amused by the effort to read all of this back into Marx rather than to claim any of it as new work, which is a sort of Talmudic tradition of scholarship that he comes by very literally in his lineage. Thompson, the great English historian, was a huge influence on me. I can tell you how I came to read The Making of the English Working Class. Peter Worsley, another figure who was very important, who will fall out of the canon of theorists, but who coined the term third world, the third world, who did fundamental work on several issues, wasn't perhaps a fundamental theorist, but was a bit like Merton, somebody who gave names to very important phenomena in things. Basically, I was talking with him about things I was interested in wrestling with in Manchester around 1974. He said, have you read Making of the English Working Class? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, all right, don't go home. You have to go to the bookstore, buy that book, don't talk to me again until you've read it, or something like that. And this is such an important book, you've got to go read it. He was right. It is an incredibly important book. Thompson was an anti-theorist, so in this conversation, he was hostile to all forms and expressions of theory. He did have implicit theory, and it wasn't that he was ignorant of it, but he was a celebrant of a radically empirical history, as, among other things, giving a respect to English workers that he thought theorizing them wouldn't give them. He came by his anti-theoretical world in a Marxist context in which theorists were often people like Althusser, whom he didn't like at all. But he really wrote famously a book called The Poverty of Theory. Really is defending the real human beings from the condescending attitudes of theorists. But he also just wrote a magnificent book, or at least wrongly titled. It's a lot of my first book arguing with him, but he's the greater thinker than I am, and he's a hugely important influence. My argument was that his theoretical claim about the making of the English working class was not true to what he actually showed in his empirical work, in a sense, which was the struggles of all sorts of people to keep themselves from becoming the English working class, to be able to maintain their autonomy in their different crafts or their local communities or their regions or their religions.
I think at this point it's over to you folks.
Okay, just on that last part, do I have to wait
No, no.
Just on that last point, you made me think about like Hayden White's book, The Tropics of Discourse. Chapter 1, he's talking about E.P. Thompson and the idea that in the making of the working class, his supposedly empirical, theoryless history is actually repeating Freud's theory of how people come into consciousness. Do you reckon that's the thing, basically?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can recognize that point. That's not my particular claim about it, but it's not wrong. So one of White's interests is, his interest is really in Freud, and then Thompson's an example of the way that an idea that will also appear as consciousness raising, a theme that is introduced by the Frankfurt School theorists from their engagement, our mixture of Freud and Marx and all of this, is a poor understanding of how people in fact change their thinking. And that we are reading something into that. So yes, I agree with that. And you know, I think Thompson could legitimately protest that that's an impoverished reading of the making, because it is not just an account of the way in which people come into consciousness. It is also an account of material struggles. And so I think that if you read it just as a sort of cultural history, the Hayden White point makes more sense than if you're looking for the political economy as well.
Susie.
Super nice to hear your reflections, Craig. You should come out more often.
Thanks.
I'm going to have a question back to Habermas. So you're talking about the ideal critical rational discourse, and I was thinking, culture, and then you went culture. But I'd like to link that to Taylor. So Taylor wrote the famous cultural and acultural approaches to modernity, and it was pretty clear in that essay that Habermas was on the acultural side, and that was actually one of his earliest expressions of social imaginaries in that paper, and then he developed it further. How can you reconcile the kind of social imaginary approach, broadly cultural approach, with the ideal rational discourse? I mean, what kind of steps do you need to take?
This is going to be an extremely incomplete and inadequate answer, but just start with the idea that our capacity to have rational critical discourse is embedded in and shaped by culture.
Yeah.
And it not by an escape from culture. So one way to think about rational critical discourse is that you escape from culture. Culture is all those biases that you overcome in order to have a pure reasoned discussion. And I think that's a little bit unfair to Habermas. That's sort of the Habermasian side, but it's certainly what Chuck means by an acultural approach. Taylor means. I would say, on the contrary, it's in language, it's in culture that we do what we call rational critical reason. Therefore, we continually confront challenges of translation, reinterpretation, and need for mutual exploration, because we do it in slightly different ways, or really different ways if we are one Chinese and one Australian or something like that. And but that the work of coming to mutual understanding, which is what Habermas is proposing the rational critical discourse for, is largely a work done in culture, but in exchanges and in the efforts to improve our hermeneutic relationships to each other in culture. I will resist the temptation to riff in a series of ways on the idea of escape, but I think it extends into, I mean, you know, things I've written about cosmopolitanism and things, but it extends into a misunderstanding that I think people have about how cosmopolitanism and having a global view might work, in which they imagine this as escaping from the local, so that there are many people who have global orientations which they understand as having overcome their bias, the bias of their local background. They then are completely blind to the fact that global culture is also culture, and that they enter into a culture when they go and go to global academic conferences or meet people in the business class section of the airplane. But it's a different culture. It's a culture of people who read the Financial Times and The Economist, and a culture of people who can have discussions about whether it's better to go to Oxford or Harvard. And the people that are at home aren't transcended in that. It may be forgotten, right? But that it's just as much culture with just as much bias. And so we shouldn't think of ourselves as overcoming culture through reason. We should think of ourselves as able to deploy reason because we have culture and are in culture, able to use it self-critically to look at aspects of our understandings of the world and our culture. Taylor would say things like in his, we have a instrumental view of language that predisposes us to think in this way in which we free concepts or content from biases, rather than an expressive account of language in which we become able to think thoughts through language and express ourselves, a more romantic theory of language, which I think makes good sense in this. But on that expressive side, we would then think of theory as, and rational critical discourse as things we do, that we are facilitated in doing by culture, but we are also biased in because culture pushes us this way or that way, just as language does. And and yet that is something to be appreciated and worked on, not overcome, because it's something core to the very human capacity to have language and to think. Does this begin to get at what you're asking about?
Yeah. Can I have a follow-up question? So with just on what you were saying, so of course Habermas, mutual understanding, and certainly in TCA became the telos of communication. What would you want to say to him about social conflict?
Habermas is not neglectful of social conflict. He's often accused of that. I don't think that's true. I think this maybe middle phase, the phase of Habermas's work from the 70s through the 90s, when he is very focused on evolution, the evolution of communicative capacity, a series of different formulations of it, is perhaps where he makes least of conflict, though there are enough other places in his work where he shows he's very attentive to it. Even there, he is not completely neglectful of it, because the resolving of conflicts is one of the driving forces in the evolution of communicative action for him. But it's always on the side of the resolving, and that's the interest, the capacity to achieve consensus, and to achieve unforced consensus in particular, but also in moral evolution, the capacity to reach Kohlberg's stage 5 and all of this is an account of a human capacity precisely to not fall into some conflicts. So it's not that he doesn't have a notion of conflict, I think. It's that he's trying to explore how language and communication, reason, can help us overcome or avoid conflicts by talking to each other, by working out common ways. You see immediately when he turns to between theory and practice that he's interested in conflictual situations. For example, the work that courts do in allowing two parties in common to have an organized interaction to try to find out what's true or what's just or what's fair, and resolve conflicts and so forth. He doesn't deal very much with conflicts that escape that, say wars, right? And the ways in which conflicts, which might have had misunderstandings as one of their roots, but also have things like different material interests, escape from this model of being overcome through language. He's not insensitive to it. In a certain way, World War II and the Holocaust is always in the back of his mind in regard to everything. But he's thinking the way in which we make society through communicative action is our path, is our chance to do that in a way that reduces the drives towards conflict that they are, and he is eternally trying to be optimistic and to see paths away from this rather than to talk about it. The critiques, say Chantal Mouffe, of him for not being attentive enough to conflict, not focusing enough on an agonistic view of the human, I think have some purchase for my taste. The agonistic interactions drive more of what goes on than for Habermas's account, but I think it would be unfair to say he doesn't think about that. He has a way of trying to think about progress past that. I would also, though, say I didn't point to Habermas for my strongest approach to the social. I pointed to Bourdieu, and then I mentioned the anthropologists, and mentioned some other things. I'd add Edward Thompson to that list. Habermas is thin and sort of unmusical, by his own use of Max Weber's phrase, on some aspects of this. So he's enormously interested in religion, not because he's religious, but because he's interested in how potentially liberatory language and thinking comes into our lives. And he thinks, again, like the unfinished discourse of modernity, there's an unfinished role of religion. But he's also just very interested, although it's interest in others, not interest in himself, in the mutuality of understanding that is forged on not rational critical grounds. So to oversimplify revelation or something like that, but reading sacred texts, whatever it is. And he's interested in that. He's looking at it from a distance, and he's not musical in that. Now, Taylor is musical in that, and Thompson's musical in that, seeing the common culture and so forth. And the way in which people come to understand themselves as inextricably connected to others so that they wouldn't cut themselves off from others and disagree. I don't think Habermas is against that, but he's not musical in it.
You made a comment before that sociology hadn't been as perhaps musical with phenomenology as it might have been. Can you just explain that just briefly?
Sure, very briefly. Sociology had lots of early interactions with phenomenology, and it could have grown into a very central part of the sociological tradition. And with someone like Schutz, who is one of these major sociologists who falls into the abyss and doesn't become a part of the heritage of classical theory. Some other early sociologists were much influenced by phenomenology. And that tends to not be seen because the contemporary sociologists don't have the engagement with the early phenomenology to read it, or with other work that is phenomenology in a broader sense, not the school of Husserlians, but the work that goes back to Hegel and comes forward through Heidegger and others in the phenomenological tradition. So I think there's lots of work. In my view, there are particular thinkers who would be important for this, Merleau-Ponty in particular, but others, and who are very much engaged with sociological questions, in part, not only. I mean, he's also writing about perception and other things, but question of violence, for example, as a phenomenological question, who is in some dialogue with sociologists, who's an enormous influence on Bourdieu, but who's sort of invisible to sociology because we don't have as much of a tradition of reading that form of philosophy to sort of see it, and that is important in several contexts for trying to understand some things in society today. And I'll give one short example, and try to be quiet. One of the big changes in society in our lifetimes, at least yours and mine, some people in the room are younger than us, is that our relationship to media and our relationship to each other through media has changed just dramatically. And to explore that well, calls for the kind of thinking phenomenology has often done about our questions like Schutz's idea of how we understand contemporaries in the world who are not in our immediate field of vision or relationships, or themes about the way in which we construct the idea of the person in interaction. So some of the very instrumentalization is shaped by mediated relationships that make it easier to see people as one-dimensional. And to explore that, one would need to, among other things, have sort of a phenomenology of the relationship to media. And people do that. And I'm not so much just advocating, oh, you have to go read Merleau-Ponty, as you have to think a certain way, but it's an aid to thinking that way, to draw on the history of phenomenology. And there's powerful work. So when I was a student, Berger and Luckman's Social Construction of Reality was a very influential book. And there, in a way, it was, I think, conceived as the sort of popular version of a inquiry that Luckman and Schutz published at greater length and other things. This was on the agenda, in a sense, or thinkers like John O'Neill, the Canadian social theorist, were influential. This didn't succeed in reproducing itself as a very prominent part of sociology. It didn't totally disappear. There are sociologists that, but not in a really major way. I think that there's very rich thinking that could help sociologists do their work in that tradition. Not that they've already done all the work and if we just read them we'd know everything, but that in terms of thinking what this means. There's an emerging sociology of disability now as people are trying to think about this. There are a rich range of phenomenological questions about that belong mixed in with sociological thinking, not separated from it, as though it's two different questions: how you interact with other people and whether you're deaf or hearing. Those aren't two completely different questions, right? They're interacted, and how this works is something that has to be explored in an attentive construction of experience, the construction of perception and understanding, which is what I think in many ways phenomenology offers. Or one of Husserl's great themes is intention. So Husserl writes a lot about consciousness. For him, consciousness is always intentional. It's always consciousness directed somewhere, consciousness of something. That's an important insight and valuable to us now as we try to come to terms with thinking about consciousness in artificial intelligence, but also what's distinctively human in this world. And we often get a notion of consciousness as a sort of semi-passive state instead of that intentional relation to the world. Well, the intentional relation to the world is very much a social relation to the world. It's in relation to other people as the important interactants of our consciousness, and it leads us to think of consciousness as intersubjective. In fact, a theme that Habermas picks up, which in some ways is a place where he, in his way of thinking, comes up with something to do some of the work that culture would be doing for other thinkers. His account of intersubjectivity, rooted in the phenomenological work, actually, that's where Habermas is getting it from, is trying to say that ideas don't just come up in individual brains. They are intersubjectively shared, and our capacities are based in some part on that intersubjectivity.
We need to draw to a close. I'll take two last questions from Peter and Trev. Back to back.
My question is about the bias of contemporary theory. And I struck a couple of your discourses ago. You made a quick reference to the readers of the Financial Times. And I immediately thought, yeah, well, those people get basically read out of social theory. They're not a class of people that social theorists on the whole, with some exceptions, tend to like. And contemporary social theory from the 60s onwards has a low opinion of such people, generally speaking. And yet at the same time, I saw your comment about Thompson in The Making of English Working Class, which was, as you I think rightly pointed out, was the efforts not to be turned into the working class. And I think Christopher Lash as well made this a very eloquent case. But let's say the Christopher Lash view of the world, which is partly historical and partly theoretical, is the exception, not the rule, in terms of, broadly speaking, contemporary social theory. So I just would be interested to hear what you think about your own reflections upon the particular biases of social theory and how that affects both its reception and also its intrinsic quality and its usefulness to us to understand the social world around us.
Trev, you want to follow on?
Okay. And listening to you today, Craig, it's striking how your published works have had different public interventions, if you like, and we've heard a lot about the ways in which you have brought into public discussion and Anglophone theory of Habermas and Bourdieu, but also Charles Taylor and the multicultural thinking, and you've done it for specific reasons, and some of that work is to bring people together in workshops and then to publish different aspects of it, so you've helped others think about these things. You've also had a public career as an institution builder and developing the social sciences, and that has meant that you've published editorial work and handbooks and encyclopedia and so on. We have mentioned that there's two other kinds of books that you've written too, where the more anthropological, expressive aspects of culture are brought to the fore for historical sociology. And obviously your first book, The Questions of Class, and then also Neither Gods Nor Emperors. And I'm just wondering where to next, whether you will return to that aspect of your work, or whether that's something that will have to be repressed because of your engagement in other spheres of activity. In other words, there's been this balance across your life, but there's been different reasons as to why you've published things. And I'm just intrigued as to what, now that you've finished being a director of a university, that you've got some space to do some other kinds of research and work, and what that might be. So it's a kind of...
I loved being director of the LSE, and I've loved all of these jobs that I've had. I'm now at a moment of regretting the price I paid for them in time I could have put into other work. But it's not that I didn't love them or I thought, oh, what a ridiculous decision, I should have stayed in my library. It's a phase that I know, and it's a perspective right now where I want to engage in ideas, and I feel a sense of urgency. I think I didn't feel the sense that the world was in great need of my interventions. I thought I was a good theorist. It's not that I'm not trying to be modest about it. I'm not trying to say I think the world was going along and I had things to say and other people had things to say, and I now feel the world is having a train wreck and shouting, wait, stop, is useful. And so I feel a greater urgency about some interventions. Not interventions on the Naomi Klein shouting stop thing, but interventions about, what would it mean to stop? Let me take what I think is the single biggest of these, though there are a lot of candidates. I think climate change and environmental degradation is enormous. I've had very little to say about that in a career. It's not likely that I'm going to say something profound about this of the kind that scientists are saying about what's going on. But I think part of that puzzle is why it is so hard for societies and people in societies to respond with an adequate sense of urgency to something that is of such basic cataclysmic significance. So that's just one, but there are a set of sociological questions about what is it that makes it hard for us to think and act and respond to something that could be of enormous and largely negative significance. And makes it, we get caught in debates about how much climate change there is, how much is humanly caused, much more than we get stuck into questions about how would we need to change social organization to be able to survive well in an era where climate change has already begun. So I think that I might have something to contribute to parts of the climate change discussion, not in the primary way as an agent of people recognizing what climate change is, but in the secondary way of helping to shape social response to climate change. Now, I think for a variety of other questions and things that I feel a sense of urgency because I feel social theory hasn't been developing in ways that make it as well suited for this kind of urgent task as it could be, to put it in a very boring way. In other words, I think we sort of went off the rails. We've got an awful lot of work on some of the questions that aren't as important in relationship to our lives as some other questions that need big attention and should get them. And so we've been a bit scholastic. We've let social theory be a bit of a scholastic inquiry, disconnected. So I say this in full Thesis 11 spirit, right? And Thesis 11 has done impressive work, but it has not always lived up to its own ideals either, right? If one of the ideals from the early issues of Thesis 11 is to really bring theory fully into engagement in contemporary politics and all that, sometimes absolutely, sometimes it's just theory, sometimes the politics doesn't have as much theory. I mean, that's not a nasty criticism, that's just the nature of it, right? That's saying you did really well, but as we've all been in the position of telling students we supervise, this is really great, but there are some things that, my sense of it, and for my own work, I would say the same thing. I would go back and say, Handbook of Sociology, who needs it? I mean, the Oxford Dictionary, that there's a lot of time and energy on some things that are perfectly useful institutional things. I would now want to redirect my energy to other things. I think that's in the nature of getting older. As you look back and say, it's exactly the same as somebody who says, if only I had brought property in the city center 30 years ago when it was cheap. Hindsight's easy. Where would I go? So I think I've actually had less to say about expressive culture in some ways than just I've been interested in that at various points, but I don't think I've done anything very fundamentally significant on expressive culture, and I don't think I will, actually, interestingly. Not that I shouldn't or that one shouldn't. I think that my strength of engagement has been around the social. And if there's a social cultural divide around the social side of that, I've just wanted to insist on the culture as part of the social and resist trends in sociology to an acultural constructing of the social. So it's not that I've had something wonderfully new to say about art or about music or about expressive culture in that sense, but I have and I will continue to argue for a more expansive thinking of the social that is, among other things, fully and seriously cultural. What am I working on now? I have a bunch of projects. I have things that got put on hold when I took a job that swallowed all of my life, which is what the equivalent of vice chancellorships do, and for most people, but at least for what my experience of leading the LSE did. I went there with a book 80 or 90% finished, called Cosmopolitanism and Belonging, which I wish I'd finished and published because the issues are very much front and center now, but which I'm not sure I want to go back and finish in exactly its old form, partly because by the time I do it and it appears they won't be front and center in the same way, and partly because my thinking about this has changed, not in fundamental ways, but in a sense, my animus, my motivation was in many ways a critique of the way cosmopolitanism was being pursued, and now that would amount to kicking people while they're down, because the cosmopolitans are under such threat and attack from new nationalists and reactionary figures of various kinds that I'm not inclined to go out and do that and then to rethink the tone of the whole exercise. So I'm still interested in that and I will still do something on it, but it's no longer that I will just finish that book. As Marx said of the Grundrisse, I will abandon it to the gnawing criticism of the rats. I did that once before, and I'm very sorry about it, though. I have a 300-page manuscript, never finished and never published, on computerization, written in the 1980s, that actually would have been interesting, given how that's come back lately, but I didn't finish that. I am keen to do work on a couple of things. One of them is infrastructure. And I think, back to that climate change question, a neglected thing in sociology. I wrote one article about this a long time ago, called The Infrastructure Modernity, is sociologists constantly think about modernity, the modern world, what's the nature of what's going on, and don't give very much weight to transportation and communications infrastructure, and in fact a whole lot of other infrastructures. Where is the sociology of plumbing? Where would the modern world be without it? And, but in a whole series of ways, how do we relate to each other? How do we live with each other? How do we inhabit the world? We inhabit the world on the basis of a variety of systems, of largely infrastructure, where the meaning of infrastructure is stuff that was cool new technology once that we now take for granted. And we have huge investments in it, and every now and then it breaks down and we realize it's there, and we have to make huge investments in renewing it. It becomes now a big topic in finance, one of the hottest things in global finance because of all the money that will go into building new airports or rebuilding old highways and bridges or all of those sorts of things. I think this shapes the social world in fundamental ways. I think that there could not have been the rise of modern nation states as we know them without the rise of national communications and transportation infrastructures that knit them together. They've been deeply shaping of what's gone on in a whole series of spheres from economics to culture. And we need to get them into our social theory in various ways and think about where they're going. In relation to climate change, one of the reasons that we can't act better on climate change is that we have put in place and keep putting in place infrastructures that commit us to ways of working that are based on the older technologies that are so polluting and carbon footprint enhancing. So we see the building of roads in China, the catastrophic error post-92 of going for an automobile society. But we see ports and containerized cargo systems globally, which are hugely polluting. And you'd have to reconstruct not just the ships, but the ports and all kinds of things to remake that. So a theme that almost doesn't figure in social theory is the sunk cost weight of infrastructure and its impact on the next period of social life by shaping the choices we can make and how we live together and how things work and how cities work and so forth. So that's an interest that I have, and to think that socially, finally, as socio-technical systems, realizing that's not just technology, which is somehow outside of society, which is out there doing that, and we're going to have driverless cars, fine. Every one of these technologies, say driverless cars, is deeply social and socio-technical. It will remake how we live together, but it will be implemented in ways that transform personal identity, social habits, laws, regulations, education and training, so that just something like driverless cars, which isn't the most complicated thing in the world, will nonetheless be, is a very socially significant thing. So that's what I'm interested in.
Do you have 2 words for the readers of the Financial Times?
I forgot to get this. So Peter's question. So I think Peter's actually made a profound general point and a specific point. The point about bias in general is very important. We very seldom remember to have a moment in social theory for looking at what we don't look at. And so we theorize some aspects of the world, and things go in and out of fashion, and we pay attention. But there are always all sorts of biases and gaps. And it should be part of our theoretical practice to sort of ask what we're not looking at. But that's very seldom the case, and so we don't see a lot of things. The particular biases of being very engaged with what we imagine to be progressive social change and the people who are bringing it about, and therefore not so interested in the people that we imagine aren't bringing it about, like the readers of the Financial Times, is an instance of that. We have ways of dealing with them. So we have people writing about global capital in sociology and people writing about global capital in the Financial Times, not quite in the same way. And it's not that there's no connection, but there's not that. There's talk about steadying up. There is less steadying up than steadying down. So if there were a study of global elites for every study of urban gangs, we would know a lot more about how the world works, but there's not. And so basically I think Peter's point is right. there is some work on that and some engagement with it, but not nearly as much as there could be.
I need to thank you all for coming. I need to thank Craig. I need to thank Pam. Hey Pam, thank you. I want to offer a, it's not small, it's actually a fairly large gift, which is Adrian Franklin's Mona book, the logic of which is to say, come back soon, as has been said before.
Or go to Tasmania.
And we'll go to Tasmania. I need to thank the people who've made this possible in terms of their support, the technical folk. I need to thank Tony McGrew and John Dewar. I need to thank you again, Craig, but especially, and I know we've done it once, but I think we need to do it again. I need to thank Team Leader Hogan, because none of this would have happened without Trevor. Trevor.
Great. And Peter, I need to thank you for the book and for so much more. Thank you, my friend. And I want to say one word in conclusion, which is thanking Thesis 11, now 37 years old. Thesis 11 was sort of always there my whole adult life in social theory, so very appropriate that you organized this. And it's nice to think of journals as having friends and not being inanimate objects. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.